Okay, let's make a start. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our latest Alliance magazine event, On the Ground, Understanding Indigenous and Territorial Funds. My name is Kate Balding, and as Features Editor at Alliance, I have the pleasure of moderating today's discussion. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, these dialogues coincide with the publication of each of our quarterly print magazines, and we hope they serve as a welcome opportunity to weigh in on some of our special feature topics. First, however, just a little bit of housekeeping. Today's event will run for approximately an hour, and the first part of that will be dedicated to our wonderful panelists, who you should be able to see on the screen, and we'll set aside 10 to 15 minutes towards the end for a Q&A. If you would like to contribute to the Q&A, and we really hope that you do, you can submit questions using the chat function, which can see lots of people are already introducing themselves on, so thank you. And there might also be another option tailor-made for the Q&A, which is called Slido, which should pop up on the right-hand side of your WebEx window, indicated with the green S. If not, the chat function works perfectly fine. Yeah, we'll be collecting those questions throughout the session, so feel free to drop those as you go, and I'll try my very best to get through as many as possible. When you do ask a question, it would be great if you could also just tell us your name and where you're based. In addition, for those who are keen to add captions in preferred language, and we have a really great spread of languages on offer, if you look in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, there should be the CC icon for closed captions. So that's there if you need it. If you do experience any technical issues throughout today's event, please, just alert us. There should be somebody on the screen, which you can see there, called Alliance Magazine. That's the black A on the white background, and that should alert a member of the team, and they'll do their best to help you as soon as possible. Then, just as an extra bonus for joining today's launch event, we're offering 20% discount code to anyone who would like to subscribe to Alliance Magazine. We're a compendium of news, analysis, opinion, all on global philanthropy specifically, and it's a really fantastic place to learn from just some of the most interesting and brightest minds in the sector. So that's there, and we'll put a link for that in the chat very shortly. Other than that, a recording of today's webinar will be made available and shared with attendees as well after the session, so don't worry if you have to pop off early. Okay, with all of that said, a little bit of housekeeping done, it's now my privilege to welcome today's panelists. So to start us off, you see on screen, we have Peter Kostashak, Senior Advisor at the International Land and Forest Tenure Facility. The Tenure Facility is the first international multi-stakeholder financial mechanism focused on securing land and forest rights for Indigenous people and local communities. And I had the real pleasure of getting to know Peter as one of the guest editors for this September edition. Also joining us today in the place of Mina Setra, who unfortunately couldn't be with us today due to illness, is Abdon Nababan. He's a social activist, environmentalist, and advocate for Indigenous people's rights. Abdon was also the recipient of the prestigious Ramon Magsaysay Award in 2017, which is often referred to as Asia's Nobel Prize, and his impact on policy and community development just makes him a really knowledgeable addition to the panel, and we're really grateful that you're able to join at such short notice. Last but not least, I'm also pleased to have here with us Renata Nadir. Renata is a Brazilian geographer and a human rights advocate and senior program officer at the Climate and Land Use Alliance. Renata has over 17 years of experience working with national and international civil society organizations, and she has a wealth of experience and expertise to share on the intersections that we'll get into on today's session. So welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for being here and giving some time to us. To start us off, I wanted to invite each of the panelists to just briefly introduce themselves and also to share how they first encountered the concept of Indigenous and territorial funds. As I'm aware, it's a topic that's still relatively new to many people in the sector and maybe many people on this webinar. So maybe Peter, can I come to you first to start us off, and then we'll go Abdon and Renata. So Peter, please do share your thoughts.
Thank you so much, Kate. And it's great to be here and wonderful to see in the chat so many friends and old friends. I have a background in the Indigenous peoples movement supporting Amazonian Indigenous movements a long time ago. And then I got into grant making through a long period with Global Green Grants Fund, where I had developed a very strong appreciation for how hard it is to get resources to communities on the ground. And that's the Global Green Grants Fund focuses on grassroots grant making. And uh, I there worked with, and I learned a lot from some of the socio-environmental funds, the environmental justice funds in the global south that have been started. And I think that some of a number of the indigenous and territorial funds have really learned from and stepped, sort of ridden on the shoulders of those funds coming into this, as well as women's funds, the feminist funds too. But I really first started getting involved with Indigenous-led funds on the board of International Funders for Indigenous Peoples at a time when they were starting a network of these funds. And at that time, it was there were a number of funds in at least that we knew about in North America, Seventh Generation Fund. There were some international funds like Pawanka Fund, some real pioneers here. But internationally, especially in the global south, we were still just discovering them. And then a few years ago, I started working with Climate and Land Use Alliance, and just had this amazing privilege and pleasure to work with a portfolio of these different indigenous and community-led funds. Some of them, many of them were brand new, just starting out. And so these were kind of grants to help them get organized or start their process of figuring out their structures. But in some cases, some of them, like the DEMA Fund in Brazil, have been around for quite a while, and I hadn't known them. But it was through that I learned about these funds, and then also realize that they have a lot to bring to the conversation, philanthropy, which is why we presented this idea about a year ago to Alliance to get them featured here.
Fantastic. Abdon, why don't you share your thoughts?
Yes, hello to everyone. Greetings from Indonesia. I'm Abdon Nababan. Yes, of course, I'm always be in the movement since my very young. So I started with environmental educations, and then I joined WALHI. WALHI is an environmental NGO forum, national organizations, and I involved in investigations, forest investigations, and forest campaigns. And I visited so many places in Indonesia, and I found that the most the victims of this all forestry policy is indigenous peoples. Since I'm belong to indigenous peoples too, from North Sumatra, I belong to Toba Batak tribes. So my soul was called to defend indigenous peoples since then. Yeah, of course, until now, almost 40 years now in these struggles. Yeah, I co-founded AMAN, Indigenous Peoples Alliance of the Archipelago, yeah, with 2,600 communities, our member, yeah, 20 millions, and to become the leader for 19 years, yeah, 4 years an executive secretary, 10 years as a secretary general, and four years as a national council, yeah, vice chair, and later become a chair. So this is very long journey for me, and since my experience with the managing indigenous peoples organizations, so I really understand that the main challenge for indigenous peoples organizations is how to mobilize resources to our movement. Yeah, because at that time, at the beginning, I started with Aman. Yeah, I have to compete with big NGOs, conservation NGOs, development NGOs that they really, yeah, you don't have a chance to win to compete with them. So that's why I'm working hard to really to convince peoples in all international meetings that I attended to say that indigenous peoples need dedicated financing mechanisms, because if we enter the what do you call it, free market grant, yeah, it's difficult for us to fund our struggles. So that's my background. Why in 2011 or between 2008 and 2009, I was an active observer for climate investment fund, World Bank fund for climate. And then I asked and I really pushed the World Bank to have dedicated grant mechanisms for indigenous people. So I started with that, and then that's become the dedicated grant mechanisms under Forest Investment Fund. So it's a long journey to have that kind of models, to have that kind of dedicated grant for indigenous peoples, and it's worked well. And then also try to persuade other NGOs network and consortium to also to develop that kind of dedicated financial mechanism. So I'm very glad when Right and Resource Initiative RRI finally they what do you call it? They initiate to have that kind of mechanisms that we know now is a tenure facility. So tenure facility is a dedicated financial mechanisms that I involved already for I involved as a founding board for 6 years. Yeah, and of course, I still continue to make to advocate for this. Yeah, to convince that we need more and more dedicated financing mechanism for indigenous peoples. Yeah, because for
Absolutely.
Indonesia, for example, yeah,
I was
we
going to say we will just pop to Renata now to move on, but we'll absolutely come back to you, Abdon, and dive into some of those mechanisms and funds as well.
okay.
Thank you. I think we could talk for
Thank you.
hours of the
Okay.
career that you've had. Thank you, Renata. I'll just move to you now quickly.
Hello, everyone. Well, I want to thank Kate, Peter, and the Alliance Magazine for the invitation to be today with you all. I am currently a senior program officer at Club Brazil Initiative. And I will just start making, a disclaimer about taxonomy. Territorial funds are the funds created by territorial movements, indigenous peoples movements, local communities movements, Afro-descendants, the so-called quilombolas in Brazil movements, as a mechanism to disburse resources to communities in close alignment with the movement's strategic vision and action. And that's what makes them so different from other funds, is precisely this close connection with the movements that created them. Now, although I had been working with several issues related to territorial rights, conflict over land, agroecology in Brazil for several years, it was only in 2022 when I started working in philanthropy that I became closer with the territorial funds and indigenous funds in Brazil. The following year, in 2022, in CLUA, we decided to do a mapping of the existing territorial funds in Brazil, their scope, their capacity, and their place within the broader ecosystem of funds, social environmental funds, intermediary funds, regranters. And this was super interesting and crucial to inform how we defined our niche and strategy towards supporting the territorial funds, and I can tell you more about this later. Now, as a philanthropy working at the intersection of climate and land, CLUA has been working for several years to support Indigenous people, Afro-descendants, and local communities movements to secure their territorial rights and ensure territorial protection and biome protection, with direct funding both to IPLC's organizations and also funding partners that worked closely with them. So it made a lot of sense for us to expand our grant making to also support the territorial funds that the IPLC movements were creating.
Fantastic, thanks, Renata. I think maybe we'll kind of we'll start sort of further on connected to the scope of the magazine to begin with, and then kind of circle back to some of the ideas that we've hinted on there. But Peter, perhaps a good place to start is just hearing a little bit more about your experience guest editing the special feature, kind of, and having that overview of all the different contributors and their stories. And I wonder if you could perhaps touch on any points or recurrent themes that stood out, or perhaps even surprised you, or reflections even from your own career that came to fruition reviewing the magazine.
Sure, yeah, and the experience of guest editing was fascinating for me. It also meant harassing a lot of dear friends and people I respect over WhatsApp to meet deadlines, but it was very, it was a great learning experience, and there are a number of, well, just how we approached it, we wanted to hear from as many of these funds as possible, but we also wanted to hear the perspective of the donors that support them, and also some of that philanthropic, the support initiatives like International Funders for Indigenous Peoples, IFIP, really get those perspectives in there. So just to say, there's so much that we were not able to put in or feature, but that's just a small piece. But in terms of, I would say there are several really key themes and issues that popped out that we're very happy to convey with this work. And the first one really just is I think Renata expressed it so beautifully, that the funds that we're featuring here, what we call Indigenous and Territorial funds, sometimes they're called Indigenous and local community funds, but the idea here is that these are funds that have been developed by social movement organizations, territorial movement organizations, and these are organizations that often have existed for many decades, and they have key roles. They represent a base. There are immense needs in that base, but they have roles as kind of a organizer and political advocacy platform to really advance the rights and issues of their base. And often these funds have come out of lengthy discussions within those movements about, okay, how do we actually get, as Abdon said, get dedicated resources for our communities, and often these funds are created because they don't have that function as a movement organization, but they know that it's needed. And as Renata said, they really depend on each other, right? These are two things that are very well connected. The funds are accountable through the structures and the governance models. Yeah. They're accountable to those movements. And what's really important here, and what we really want donors as well to take away from this, is that they're not trying to compete with each other. That's not the intent at all. The idea is to mobilize additional resources, and not to have the funds get in the way of all of this important advocacy and organizing work that the movement groups do. And that's just one really key fundamental message. And it's also, as Renata said, it's something that distinguishes these funds from a really vibrant and important set of philanthropic or grant-making infrastructure that's out there. A second point is that, and I think this is represented nicely in the piece that IFIP presented, or wrote for the International Funders for Indigenous Peoples, wrote for the magazine, as well as the First Nations piece on the Great Bear Sea, is that these funds are part of a pathway to self-determination for these territories. And this is, I speak specifically about the indigenous-led funds, although this also would apply to other quilombolas and other local communities. But the funds themselves, what they do is they allow the communities and their movement organizations to set priorities, to develop the mechanisms to make decisions on their own. These are all key aspects of self-determination. And also they really take on this important role of nurturing relationships with communities. And I think that we know that's a key piece within philanthropy, but these funds are especially well suited coming from the movements to be able to build those relationships. And they're not only stewards of financial resources, but they're supporting communities who are stewards of cultural, environmental, other resources on the ground, and knowledge too. So that's really key. So to think of these funds not just as moving money, but actually essentially stewarding a relationship in which many different resources come together. Another key thing, I think this came up in the in conversation piece that we did with Kai Carter from Waverly Street and Erica Yamada from Ford Foundation, is that the needs in the communities where these funds work are extremely diverse. And I think there's a bit of an effect that came from the forest tenure pledge from the Glasgow Climate COP, where $1.7 billion was pledged by a group of private philanthropy and government donors to support the territorial rights of indigenous peoples and local communities in tropical forest areas. And while some of that, I think a significant portion of that was new money, a lot of it was money that was already being spent. But it shifted a lot of the conversation towards around community rights towards this issue of climate and forests, and that is an extremely important thing. And a lot of these funds developed in response to that. They developed their language and their framing in terms of that. Okay, forests, climate, indigenous rights. But I think it's really important, and this is a real reason why we wanted to bring this concept to Alliance as well, is that the needs in the communities are so much more diverse. There's economic sustainability needs, there's preservation of language and culture, there's health and traditional medicines, there's education, there's gender justice, youth justice. There are so many issues, and these funds really are designed, and you can look at their mission statements. They're much more broad than just something about forests and climate. And not that I don't value that too, but I think that's really important for us as a philanthropic community to think about all of the different points of entry. And so whereas many of these funds know, and the kinds of donors I know supporting these funds are often coming at it from one area, these funds are also needing resources to work on other needs. And so I think that also relates to what Abdon said. And then the last thing I just want to say here is, because these funds were established by movements, and those movements went through and are going through now very difficult conversations about money, what money can do to your movement, how it can disrupt and settle, how it can be used for good, how it can leverage power. I think that they have a lot to say to philanthropy about how you fund movements. I think they have a lot of experience, and it's built into their creation, this question and about the relationship between movements and money. And I know in Alliance there are a lot of articles about this, how to fund movements. I think I wrote one once too. So not just this issue, but this is a big theme. Some funders groups like Edge Funders Alliance have really taken on this question, and I think that I guess this leads to the sort of second reason we wanted to bring this to Alliance. We're just looking for platforms where these funds can also contribute, be at the table, share their experiences, learn from other donors, but also be there as donors with certain expertise, and particularly in this issue of how do you fund movements and how's that done, particularly from the ground up.
Yeah, absolutely. I think even from editing it, the network approach is throughout is so integral to all of these funds, and it's something I think we can definitely learn from elsewhere. Maybe let's bring Abdon back in here. I mean, Abdon, you've got many years of experience working with Indigenous movements and donors, and you've helped actually develop dedicated funding mechanisms for Indigenous and territorial rights. But I'd be quite interested to know what you think the main rewards or challenges are associated with these kinds of funds.
Yes, of course, before I come to your questions, so my experience, and also because I'm learning, and I'm still learning about indigenous peoples, even in my countries, even in my own community. Yeah, but what we really convinced right now, how to keep three things: the preserving our indigenous values. That's very important because it's the basis for everything we are going to do with climate change, biodiversity, maybe sustainable development goals, anything. So the how to preserve this indigenous value. The second, of course, is how to strengthening the self-governance, indigenous self-governance. And then the third, yeah, maybe this is related to what we discussed here, uh, reclaim our territorial sovereignty. Yeah, these three things, of course, we need to work with with other with NGOs, with academic, and so on. Of course, also with a donor. So this is it, and also from my experience, yeah, yeah, with this movement, because we are very, yeah, each communities, they have a difference between indigenous peoples. Yeah, so we always feel like as an activist, we all will feel there is so many work to do, and so many people working on it actually, because that's their life. They want to do it to sustain their life, but we always uh, in the situation of short on fund. That's the situation at that time, yeah, because it's very small amount of fund that come to indigenous movement at that time. So because of this, so I started. I said before that we need to think about this, and ask more and more people, more and more friends, really to think about this, how to fund these struggles. So to bring what do you call it, the philanthropy more closer to the movement. That's the really what we are going to always do. Yeah, how to bring them, not maybe not become the movement itself, at least become a brother and sister, so we can talk to them frankly. Yeah, as a friend, not as a, what do you call it, as a boss or something like that, to make a more equal relationship. So that's the first, because we know for Indonesia, for example, we know that we need a lot of resources to even to map our indigenous territory. Yeah, at least in our preliminary data, the indigenous peoples in Indonesia now live with in 84 million hectares of land, and most of them is still forest or the best ecosystems we have. And of course, yeah, after mapping, you have to do advocacy on legal things. Yeah, like in Indonesia, for example, we have more than 500 districts. We have to work so many. So, and also in the hard situations, we also deal with intimidations, criminalizations. Yeah, so many things happen. So that's why really the 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 reasons behind this the demand to have dedicated mechanisms for indigenous peoples and local communities. Yes, and the other things, yeah, based on our experience, yeah, our our leaders, yeah, spend a lot of time and effort on in doing fundraising, yeah, but even greater amount in projects implementations with this reporting and then because they monitor us, they evaluate us in maybe so it's too much energy, yeah, if related to the funding, yeah, because the standard is too high for indigenous peoples, even the language. If we talk about forest, it's different, the meaning of the forest for indigenous peoples and for others, for Western science, even to bring them together. So actually, these mechanisms not only about funding, it's also about the bridging, the to bring this together, yeah. And we discuss as a family, yeah, to try to understand each other. So sometimes people think this is about money. Of course not. We just need to have the friends to discuss even the movement, not only the money. Yeah. So that's the reasons behind this. That I involve in the DGMs establishments, also in the NUR facility. Yeah. And also, I glad to hear that now in Asia level we have Indigenous Peoples Indigenous People Solidarity Fund (IPAS), and also now in Indonesia, even we can consolidate not only indigenous people movement, yeah, we together with with agrarian movement and also environment movement, yeah, we established the Nusantara Fund together, yeah. So these things, I think, of course, in this webinar also us to things together, yeah. But that's the real needs for indigenous peoples to have such mechanisms. The new paradigm and doing philanthropy and doing grant making, yeah, and also the new way to to interact each other, yeah. So and of course from what I observed for the last 5 years, yeah, with IPAS, with the NUR facility, even the NUR facility almost 10 years now, 8 years already, yeah. So it's reduced administration's burden for the movement, yeah. That's the first that I observed. And the second, of course, the direct fund management. Yeah. Now more and more fund go directly to the community, yeah, and become part of the movement itself, yeah. And also the third, now is easier for us to capacitate ourselves because there is quite more fun to capacitate ourselves with uh, so many, because we need new skill in doing this, of course, yeah. You cannot do this only with indigenous traditional knowledge, no. Yeah, we keep forest dead with our knowledge, but in managing the fund, of course, we need the another skills that we have to capacitate ourselves for that. So I think that's my observations. Yeah, I'm very glad with there is more and more fund now, yeah, that dedicated to indigenous peoples and local communities. yeah, I'm very confident that this will bring a lot of change for us, yeah, in the next future. Thank you.
Fantastic. Yeah. I think definitely speaking, using frankness, I think is something we don't see enough probably between each other and all the different angles that we all speak on. So yeah, absolutely. Be great to see things more as a family and less as a business. Renata, let's maybe bring you in here, and your background includes research and advocacy from a whole array of interconnected areas you mentioned, from criminal justice systems, public security, resources, economic, social rights, so many things. But for some in our grant-making communities, and likely those on this call, connections between Indigenous and territorial funds and these wider areas of philanthropic action, which might be more familiar, might not be very obvious. And I would be interested if you could speak a little bit to how they are related and how these funds are not just a niche concern.
Wonderful, Kate. Well, Brazil has a very vibrant and dynamic and growing ecosystem of territorial funds. And I think this is a reflection and a consequence of the vibrant and dynamic ecosystem of social movements, particularly territorial movements, indigenous movements, quilombola movements, and organized movements of other local communities. Artisanal fishermen, babasu nut breakers, rubber tappers, pastoralists, and so on. As I mentioned before, there's and Peter and Abdon as well, there's a very strong connection between the funds and the movements that created them, and that's what makes the potential impact of supporting both the movement and the funds so relevant for long-lasting and structural change and for philanthropy. Now, CLUAN, both the Secretariat and its member foundations, we have been supporting a range of territorial funds in Brazil in the past years, and we have had several learnings from this process that I want to flag some of them to you here. The first one is, the importance of understanding precisely the specific role of territorial funds and the added value of channeling the support to communities through them. Because they are created by the movements, they will be disbursing resources in close alignment with the movement and to communities which are supported by the movements. And that is what creates greater synergies. When a territorial fund opens a call for proposals focused on, let's say, supporting local production in communities, but when they engage with the communities that they are supporting through that call for proposals, they can find out that the community is in a situation of violence, that there are people there who are threatened with their lives, or they will find out that there are no access to health facilities or education. And these are situations that the fund, through that call for proposals that was for local production, will not be able to respond immediately, but the movement that created the fund can respond to that, because it is in the mandate of the movement to reach out to authorities, to advocate for all those public policies on a range of issues. They can, act for critical response in situations of conflict and so on. So, at the same time that, the fund can, disperse resources, they are also, in close connections with communities and understanding and identifying a broad range of issues that are happening at the territorial level, and the movement can respond to that later. At the territorial level, the reality is integrated. It doesn't exist in segmented silos, right? So looking also beyond the discussion of autonomy and direct funding, this close connection between the fund and the movement is a unique arrangement, a unique combination to respond to the complexities on the ground that can make it potentially a very effective way of generating meaningful change. The fund with its own role, and the movement with its own role, but working together. We as donors need to understand this close connection and don't reduce funding to the movements in order to fund the territorial funds. This is a clear message that both the movements and the funds have been telling us, that the fund will only be as strong as the movement. So both of them needs to be equally funded by donors. A second learning is that funders, philanthropies, we need to understand that the non-grant making activities of the territorial funds matter a lot for the work that they do. They are not just a financial mechanism to disperse resources to communities, as Peter and Abdon said. They have this critical role of understanding the community's needs, in supporting them in executing the resources for successful, long-lasting outcomes, to generate learnings from that experience with that community for other communities and for the movement. This is an invisible work, a backstage work that the territorial funds do, and that requires significant resources, particularly when you consider the size and the logistics of traveling in the Amazon to reach out to remote communities. So when supporting territorial funds, donors and philanthropists should really consider their regular targets, reconsider actually their regular targets of the percentage of the grant that they are imposing is for re-granting, and how much can be used for the other non-grant making activities of the territorial funds. The third learning is, philanthropies need to understand the diversity of territorial funds, their diverse ways of working, of operating, their diverse governance structure, their diverse decision-making processes. This diversity is obviously a reflection of the diversity of indigenous peoples, Afro-descendants, and local communities groups themselves, and it should be respected. Funders should not be imposing a way of working that can ultimately be disruptive of the governance decided autonomously by an indigenous group or a local community or a territorial movement. Now, in practice, this means a lot of work for funders sometimes, because this can mean that you have to work in a very different way with each territorial fund you're supporting. And it also means that you have to rethink and reinvent your own internal processes as a funder to be able to, support territorial funds. The other learning is that, I would say, we as donors, we should really be aware of the broader ecosystem of intermediary funds and regranters operating in a certain region and country that we're working. Each one has its own role and fulfill different purposes, so there is no need for competition. Each one has a role, its niche. The territorial funds has a niche, a bigger social environmental fund has another niche, a big regranter another one. And as donors, we should understand this and invest in a way that fosters complementarities and collaboration and not competition. And I would say, finally, the last point is, we as donors should truly listen to what the territorial funds and the movements are telling us, because the indigenous and territorial funds are ultimately provoking a discussion about reshaping the philanthropic ecosystem. They are discussing what, from their perspective, means a trust-based approach to philanthropy. They're discussing how to decolonize philanthropy. So in the end, this is not only about increasing direct funding and making sure resources reaches communities on the ground. This is also about reshaping the philanthropic ecosystems. And we should be truly open to listen and not put the territorial funds in a box as a financial mechanisms for direct funding. And I would strongly suggest for all of us here to, for example, listen to the Amazonian Network of Community Funds, which is a network with around 10 territorial funds here in the Amazon, which has become a very important space on two fronts. One, it is a collective space for shared learning and dialogue for the funds themselves. But two, it is becoming a collective stakeholder that can dialogue with donors in a cohesive way, with more strength than they would have as individual funds, especially considering that there is a huge, gap between an international donor and a local territorial fund. So the Amazon network was created in 2022, and in the past 3 years, they have been, provoking this debate about this, how to reshape the philanthropic ecosystem and how to create more equal relations between donors and the territorial funds on the ground.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Renata. I'm just glancing at the clock now and aware we are rushing towards the end and the Q&A. So just a reminder for everyone joining us, if you would like to pop some questions into Slido, then I can direct them to the panelists. Before that, however, maybe I'll just ask one final question to each of you, and bearing in mind time, perhaps you could try and keep it to a one sentence answer. It's a bit of a challenge. But specifically, perhaps we could end by answering the following question, which is, what would each of you say to funders who would like to engage with Indigenous and territorial funds, but who are unsure and maybe uncertain of how to start, where to start? Peter, maybe I'll come to you first.
Yeah, I think a lot of the key here is about how do you build relationships, and because we look at funding in terms of risk, and if we don't know a group or where they're coming from or the people involved, and we don't have that trust, then the risk seems high, right? And so to do that, yeah, I would look at, as Renata just said, look at the associations and groups of these funds, like the Amazon Network of Community Funds in Brazil. The International Funders for Indigenous Peoples has a network of Indigenous-led funds and can be also a great source. The Global Alliance of Territorial Communities, which is an international movement group focused on collective territorial rights, they have something called the Shandia platform, which is a platform of movement-led funds that they know and that they trust. But I think the other thing I'll say is talk with the donors that have been supporting these funds too. And we know that foundations do that all the time. We triangulate, we talk with our colleagues, and that's great too. So Renata and her colleagues at CLUA, Tenure Facility, works with many of these funds. The Christensen Fund has supported them, Ford Foundation, Waverly Street, Wellspring. There are so many, Packard Foundation as well. I'm sure I'm leaving some out, but do talk with those funders as well, and say, hey, can you make an introduction? And I'd like to know them. I'd like to get to know these organizations better.
Great. Renata, maybe we'll come to you next.
Okay, yeah, I would just add to that, to what Peter said, that I think it's crucial to understand both the ecosystem of territorial funds within the broader ecosystem of intermediary funds, but also understand the ecosystem of funders who are already supporting territorial funds. So you can identify also, where are the gaps in funding and what is potentially your niche in entering that space as a donor. And, just to mention, one of the niches we identified for CLUA in Brazil was supporting the territorial funds in their institutional strengthening, because donors were other donors were supporting these territorial funds with the resources for the call for proposals, and the funds were lacking flexible resources for the institutional strengthening, for monitoring and evaluation of the projects, and for their other non-grant making activities. So really having a reading of the landscape is super important, because then you can understand what can be your added value in starting to invest in that area. The other thing is consider also and you can ask both the territorial fund and the movement about that, of course, to hear it from them, but consider also what other types of support beyond the financial support that territorial funds need, because we as donors can also arrange for a multiplicity of supports to those territorial funds, financial, of course, as a grant, but also other types of technical support. So consider also these other types of support that as a donor you can also provide.
Great. And then Abdon, very, very quickly.
Of course, as a practitioners, I want to talk to the donor, say that this is not only we can talk about help support indigenous peoples movement with grant. From my experience in the last 4 years, helping indigenous peoples in Papua to have their own enterprise. Yeah, so now I'm convinced that they can, indigenous peoples even can be a partner in doing business, not only only in grant making. Yeah, so because we started working with 2 tribes in Papua, for example. They have their territory quite huge, yeah, at least uh, uh, 33,000 hectares. And now we just started working with one community that they have 400,000 hectares. It's feasible for doing business. Of course, not in extractive one, yeah, because it's related to biodiversity, even climate mitigations. So we don't have yet, because now we also try to talk to donor that to diversify their support, not only as grant and or technical support. Yeah, maybe if possible, if the community have their own economic institutions, yeah, let's do business with indigenous peoples, yeah, for good, yeah, not, yeah. So empower them, because from my observations after so many years working with indigenous peoples, we need to enrich them in economic, yeah, because in the political they have a strong institutions, indigenous institutions, self-governance, or also in culture, yeah, and social. But in economic, yeah, they have to learn how to to work in the market, yeah, the real market, and also work with investment. Yeah, if there is a good from the conventional donor, yeah, also can help them with the different kind of investment, yeah, with indigenous peoples. That will be a good things to think about. Yeah, so I just started it in Papua, so with Mitra Buma. So you can check it in Google about Mitra Buma. So we learn now how to, because after recognitions, after mapping and then legal recognition, what next? Of course, to strengthen their management, strengthening their daily life. Yeah.
This might actually, touching on sort of conventional funders, we have a question from Paul Wolverkamp, who's asked, could the speakers expand on any examples where more conventional funders can or have been convinced to invest and actually hand over control to local funds? What are the arguments of proof which could help? So any actual like hard maybe case examples or even lines that have helped to convince perhaps unwilling or unconvinced conventional funders. Does anyone want to take that one?
Sure, I'll jump in. Hi, Paul. I guess I mean I think the funders that I know that are supporting these funds are doing it because they also see it as critical to their strategy. You know, and these are mostly on the, as I mentioned before, the climate and forest rights donors. They see these communities as critical to the defense of those forests, and they need their collective rights to those forests and the ability to exercise those rights and to stay in those territories to defend that. And they realize, well, the resources that I can give as a international foundation are large and not going to be very useful at that community level. So if I work with a local fund that has those relationships and can get the right size grant to the right community, then I'm doing something that advances my strategy. And obviously they're doing that in conjunction with a suite of grants that are supporting the movement organizations, supporting advocacy, research, other things. But maybe that framing can be helpful. But and Packard Foundation has done this. And I'll say another angle that is becoming more mainstream, but still a little bit out there, is the more trust-based philanthropy, and philanthropy that really is trying to divulge power. And so from that sort of ethical or values standpoint, they see these funds as a way to contribute to their values.
Fantastic. And we'll just go on. We've got another question from Nydia G, who has asked, I want to learn more about how to develop a roadmap to help grow this area of giving towards real community needs. And I guess they might be asking, what might be in that roadmap, or what might be on that roadmap? Could be a way to answer this question. If anyone has any thoughts. And if not, I'll potentially pick on someone. Maybe Renata, can you, what might be on that sort of roadmap?
Can you repeat, Kate, the roadmap? I'm not sure if I got the question.
So the question is essentially for somebody that would like to develop roadmaps towards giving that actually meets community members' needs. How does one develop that roadmap? What are the core components that might be on that roadmap to make sure that, yeah, the giving goes to where it's actually meant to have impact?
Yeah, I would say that the idea of roadmaps sometimes scare me, because it seems that, and I'm not saying that is the case with this particular question, but that we might want to find a one-size-fits-all solution or a silver bullet that what will work for a certain community in Indonesia is very different from what will work with a community in Brazil or in Mexico, or even inside our own country. There will be very different. So I would say the first thing is be aware that you won't have one roadmap, but that you need to have, a diversity of roadmaps, because the reality is diverse. And when we try to oversimplify it, we are risking not being effective in the support we want to give. So this is one sort of, disclaimer from the beginning. The second is you can't develop a roadmap without, hearing the people who are on the ground. So I would say if you want to develop a roadmap for a certain, to better, support a certain group of communities, this has to be developed together with them. It can't be just you as a philanthropist or, a think tank or university, because, it has to be, it has to build from the needs, the knowledge, the experience, and the reality of the communities and the movements. And I think that with territorial funds, this connection with the movements, again, is so important and so strong, because the movements have been, representing these communities for, decades. And they know the reality very well, and the diverse reality of the communities they represent. So you have to build from that. I think one of the mistakes that sometimes philanthropy often, incur with is not building from that and trying to bring an external and an outsider vision to that, instead of, building from the communities. So I would say these are the two things to build roadmaps.
Fantastic. Thank you, Renata. Again, I think it's always tempting to rebuild the wheel then rather than build with it and what already exists. So thank you for your reflections. And with that, we've actually reached the end of this afternoon session. I hope that everyone that's still with us has learned and enjoyed as much as I have. And obviously, please join me in thanking Abdon, Peter, Renata for joining us and their generous conversations. Thanks also to Jody and the events team at Alliance, and obviously to all of our contributors of the special feature who really brought it to life. And yeah, thank you for joining us, to our audience also, and for contributing to to these conversations. They're really important, and it's great to have them. So thank you, everyone. Have a lovely rest of your day. And that's all from us. Thank you.